Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to our second episode ever. I'm here with my very good friend Maddy. Today we're just going to talk about what Maddy's experience was like in the education and the work that she's doing now. So welcome Maddy. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Vanessa. Looking forward to this conversation. My name's Maddy Ross. I'm currently doing a master's in social justice education at OISE. I'm interested in educational equity, specifically high school graduation disparities and access to education among young people living in low-income communities. I work as a community-based research practitioner, and I support governments or local organizations to engage different stakeholders and develop policy or strategy or program development that resonates with them.
I love what you're saying about high school disparities, and I think I'll get into that a little bit later. So I know
For
that
sure.
you did work for Pathways to Education. Can you tell us a little bit about what your experience was like working there and what was one of your greatest takeaways?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess I'll start by talking how I got connected to the organization because that goes way back to 2010 when I first started high school. The neighborhood I grew up in and was living in had very low high school graduation rates, something like 50% dropout rate the year I entered grade 9.
Wow.
So right when I was starting high school, there was this heightened attention to that specifically, and Pathways to Education started the program in my community the year I entered grade 9. So I was part of that program, and through Pathways, I got access to like tutoring support, financial support. I was matched with like a mentor who supported me, and I've stayed connected to the organization ever since I was a student, now as an alumni. And last year I actually had the opportunity to work at the national level to support the alumni relations team. And that was a really cool experience connecting with young people who went through the program, not only from my community, but from diverse communities all across the country. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's wonderful. There's a lot within that I didn't know. I didn't know that there was connections outside of Toronto. So if you're a student looking to get involved or looking for resources at Pathways, how do you go about finding those?
Yeah, so for high school students, it's based on geography. So you have to live within a specific catchment area to be eligible for the program. And then outside of that, they're always looking for volunteers. They're a volunteer-based organization. So you can volunteer at the national level, supporting alumni and helping connect them to opportunities, or you can work at the local level in a Pathways community. And they're always looking for mentors or now volunteer tutors. And something that's really cool is that a lot of alumni go back to support the program and deliver it after they've graduated. So it feels like a full circle, and there's a lot of really connected community there.
I love that. Once you get support from the community, you're going back in and helping support the next generation. That's great. So I want to talk to you about, so you're talking about the dive in how you got connected with Pathways, but what led you to one, entering into the education field of social justice and then just having jobs and careers rooted in social justice? So what drew you to this field?
I think it was just chance and my life experience. Back when I was in high school, I was part of a participatory action research project in my community, and we developed a youth strategy for the city of Kingston focused on better supporting young people in path to well-being. And from that project, there are many educational partners, but that was really just a revolving door for me. Opened so many opportunities to different organizations and conferences and network. And yeah, it just felt like a snowball from there. I never really consciously decided like I'm going to go into social justice education, but it just emerged that way based on what I was interested in and what I was doing, the communities that I was part of.
I love that. Sometimes you don't have the answers to the questions, especially when you're a young person and told to constantly think about your future. Sometimes your future just happens spontaneously based off of the things you're interested in at the moment. That's great. Okay, so what was your experience like growing up in Kingston, Ontario? And for those of us who don't know where Kingston, Ontario is, can you give us a brief geography lesson? Because I feel like before I met you, I had no idea what Kingston was.
That's fair enough. It's on the 401, right in between Montreal and Toronto, pretty much.
Nice. And your experience
about 2.5 hours from Toronto.
Okay. So that's actually quite far. So one, what led you to coming and doing school at U of T? And then how was your experience growing up in Kingston with regards to education? So I know you talked a little bit about your high school having a low graduation rate. Can you get into that a little bit more, but with regards to your personal experience?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Kingston is an interesting place because there are 3 post-secondary institutions: Queen's University, St. Lawrence College, and then the Royal Military College. So there's actually, I think at one point, maybe they still do have that highest PhDs per capita in like North America or Canada. But it's also a historical city. It was the first capital of Canada, and there's a lot of relics of that, especially Sir John Hay Macdonald, glorified all around the city. And it's a historically very divided, socioeconomically divided city. There's a clear difference between the North End and the side that where Queen's University is and all of the hospitals. And I grew up on the North End of the city, which is an amazing community. But it was somewhat stigmatized, and the elementary school I went to was very socioeconomically diverse. You had kids living in abject poverty, and then in the same classroom, people whose parents were professors. And so I think in education, or at least public education, is something I came to really value because of that exposure to diversity, and really makes you think about where you come from, and you're all part of the same community. You can't really ignore certain social issues because they're right there. And a lot of my teachers were activists and musicians, and that really developed, I think, like a critical consciousness.
Yeah, I love that.
That I appreciate now as I'm older. Yeah.
I think cool. More teachers need to be artists and activists, like not to disregard intelligence, but I think it brings in a different level, like you're saying, of consciousness into the classroom when you're working with people who are coming from so many different places, socioeconomically and racially. I think it allows you to have a broadened understanding of how to deal with so many groups of people.
Absolutely. And really at the end of the day, they were just educators who brought politics into the classroom. Nice. And social context. They didn't pretend that their classroom was a meritocracy and that individuals were responsible for their outcomes alone. And I think that made a huge difference because it allowed students to succeed regardless of, or allowed educators to support students to succeed regardless of the context that they were coming from in their education. And I think that's partly why like you see this high school graduation disparity, because the reasons kids leave high school before graduating for the most part have nothing to do with the actual school, and it's not anything to do with like their value for education or opportunities in the future. It's really just they're young and navigating barriers that are difficult to overcome. Sometimes if you have to prioritize, school can't be a top priority, as horrible as that is. And yeah, I think if you bring politics and critical consciousness into the classroom, it helps kids stay in school.
Mm-hmm. For the kids who, like in your research and your experiences, for the kids who are more geared and kind of guided towards dropout rates, what are some alternatives to motivating them to staying in school?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we often hear about like at-risk youth, and I really hate that term because it suggests that, I mean, it seems to imply that like kids are experiencing risk to graduation, but really what it does is it like allows school systems to check off risk factors or boxes, and then like assess risk as what's going to jeopardize our desired future state, like for the economy or like the public purse even. And so it's not really risk to the students, it's assessing and projecting this identity onto a young person, like you are a risk. And so I think first of all, it's moving away from language like that. And when that happens, you see that any young person who has all of their basic needs met, like transportation to school, that's such a fundamental thing, but really is a major barrier for students, especially living in rural areas or large urban centers where they can't just walk to school. If all of those basic needs are met, vast majority of students will stay in school.
So it's basic needs and actually looking in general just what they need to be able to partake in the system. Like you're saying, there's, for example, refugee students whose their number one priority might not be school. They have other things like providing food and shelter to their families. So when they're at school, it could be adding more stress to them. So how can we support them in ensuring like something as small as just having a breakfast program and just like benefiting students in that way is often a good strategy to use. And like, I feel like asking you that question, there's so much that can be said and so many resources that I think we need to do our part in helping and providing what resources are going to keep students in, but it's not a one fix for every student.
Absolutely. But we also have to remember that policy has major implications for students. Like in the early 2000s and late 1990s in Ontario, there's the Safe Schools Act. Don't quote me on that.
No.
But it created like a zero tolerance policy for certain behaviors. It was basically like minimum sentences for students, and if they were suspended, they had to go through disciplinary programs to even gain access back into the school. It's just, especially disciplinary policy has major implications for students, and in no way should there be expulsion or suspension for most behaviors. Obviously there are exceptions, but disciplinary policy is a significant factor when we're talking about access to education as well.
Oh, 100%. And it's definitely not to the same extent it was back then, but getting suspended for missing school is still very much a present thing.
It was around that time that education policy in Ontario was changing a lot, and that it was like 1999 when they switched from 5-year high school to 4-year, and they saw the graduation rate when there was a transition to 4-year high school plummet completely. And so that's actually, like, provincially speaking in Ontario, when the at-risk discourse emerged. Like, there was an at-risk working group, and all school boards were required to have an at-risk committee. And so that language at risk is necessarily, at least in Ontario, in education, rooted in addressing high school graduation disparity.
I did not know that at all. Thank you. I'm gonna like definitely look more into that. But again, just informative information, even when looking at the word at risk and using it all the time, especially in social justice work. I don't think we realize the effect that has, especially when we're going into communities, even if they are our own communities, and just thinking like, I'm here today with these at-risk students. Like, that definitely is not a good feeling if you're a student being constantly told that you're in poverty and you have a low socioeconomic status. Some of these kids don't even know what that means, but they feel like it's a divide, and you're dividing them further than how they already feel. So I like that, just being conscious with how we're using words when we are servicing people who might not have the same opportunities as us. That's great.
Definitely. Yeah, language matters so much. Even though if it seems like a neutral term, it usually isn't. And so, yeah, terms we use determine like the frame that we're understanding the populations that we're working with, or members of our own community. And so, yeah, I think especially for folks in social justice education, that's something we need to constantly be evaluating and iterating.
I 100% agree. I remember I think it was the second year of university, and my stepfather, he's Jamaican, and he still has a pretty strong accent. But I remember coming back and like telling him all the things I was learning, and I think it was like the first year I started learning about immigration issues too. And he's like, I actually don't understand anything you're saying. And he's like, just speak in English. And I was like, but I am speaking in English. But I didn't realize when I was speaking to him, I was using all of these academic words that were taught to me. And I felt great because my vocabulary was expanding and I had all of these new words I can use. But it did a disservice when I brought those words back to the people that I was trying to help. They were like, what are you trying to say? What does this mean? How to make sense of that? So again, I feel like when we are in academia, but we are activists at the same time, it's like, how can we blend both words and language to actually be accessible? Because I think a lot of times people are not aware that language also is inaccessible to people in certain pockets, because education is power, and a lot of people don't have access to that power and that higher institutions. So just being more conscious about that is something, personally, that's a personal journey for me that I'm trying to figure out. At the same time, I very much am like a one word a day type person, where I want to expand my own knowledge as a person. So it is tricky, but at the same time, just being mindful moves a long way.
And I think that tension is inherent, because you're right, like it's very empowering to like find language that allows you to like really speak about experience or what you already know. You find new words to use to describe that. At the same time, it can be exclusionary. So it's just, yeah, I think context matters and understanding audience. Like when I get my dad to edit my papers, he's like, this is bullshit, like academic, like jargon, like this literally means nothing. And then I'll get like a great mark. And because my professor speaks that language, he's like, this is the worst type of writing. I know like conversation and writing are different, but I think about that all the time. Like when I'm writing or saying something, like what would this be accessible to, like if I'm talking to someone on the street? Maybe not. But I also think in social justice, like there is value in like intellectualizing things, not in a way that's inaccessible, but just generally, I think theory is really, really important, but only to the extent that it translates into practice. And when that does happen, it's so powerful. But sometimes the path there can be a little murky.
Yeah, 100%. In one of my courses, we were talking about Asada Shakur, and in her autobiography, it just talked about like consciousness and how that is freeing. But you can't come to consciousness without education, right? Without knowledge that is outside of your scope, because you need to understand the way the world operates and you need to understand systems in order to be freed of those systems. So I agree with you. There's something so liberating and powerful about learning, but at the same time, how can we then go and translate what we're learning to free other people, but at the same time kind of just like extend a hand so that we're like pushing them up to then partake in that language and that dialogue with us. But I do think it is like a double-edged sword. I don't know how to go about it yet. I'm still in the process of trying to figure it out. But I think when you get to a professor level, or just like someone who continues to move up in education, I do hear a lot of people saying that when they first write or when they edit their work, they go, can a 10-year-old understand this? But then there are some professors who do not care and they just want it to be academic, and that's that. And if you can't read it, they actually get more excited when you have to like dissect their work. So I just think it's person by person.
Absolutely. And like in a different context, but kind of along the same theme, like when I'm doing a research project with high school students, participatory research, some students I've worked with have wanted nothing to do with like writing a formal research report. It doesn't interest them at all.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd rather like do something creative, like make a Zine or video production. But then more recently, I was working with a group of students and they wanted to do the formal publication and write a research report. And that just reminded me that like, it really just depends on context, and you have to leverage your relationships and
Mm-hmm.
meet people where they're at. And that's actually what allows us to be critical thinkers. It's not assuming that it's going to be one thing, but allowing it to emerge and embracing that when it does.
I love that. So actually, I'm going to transition us because you just said something that allows us to do that in a very meaningful way. So when you're working with high school students or you're working within the community, as a white woman, how do you go about centering yourself in educational spaces?
For sure. I think the first thing is that I would never like go blindly into a community or somewhere where I didn't already have relationships or connections.
I love that.
That just to me, that feels really inappropriate or awkward. And so I always start with like the community I already have, or work with someone else who has that community and is that bridge. I think that's really important. And then especially when populations, like in a project, have very different experiences or identities as myself, it's especially important to like ground the process in relationships, and rather than sticking to like a strict structure, just go with the flow and really allow that emergent quality to come out, because that's what will allow for constructive communication if there is something that I'm doing or someone else is doing that needs to be addressed. And I think that just provides a better learning setting for everyone else anyway, because it allows you to bring your whole self to a space and like maybe that leads to something else really powerful. But again, it's this idea, like, not pretending that a space can be neutral. They're never neutral. No people are neutral. We all come with our politics and our identity. So it's about acknowledging those and then figuring out what they mean together in a certain space.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah, my identity is political based off of how I have to take up spaces. So I love that. You center yourself by just being aware of who's in that space and how you navigate it. That's really powerful. I like that you said you also just kind of go with the flow. And with that, so being in school, being at a master's level of education, have you created what is like known as a teacher's philosophy?
No.
Okay. That's fine. I just hear people using that terminology all the time. I personally have not created one for myself. I can like think of things that I would want in my classroom or like spaces I would want to create, but I haven't like taken the time to write out my philosophy.
Yeah, I haven't done that either, but definitely grounded in relationships, looking at different topics at different levels, like historical, system level to individual, and understanding how patterns emerge in that way. I think, yeah, my pedagogy is very emergent.
I like that. I'm just gonna sit with that for a second, because I feel like we're evolving people, so it makes sense for your pedagogy to be constantly evolving as well. Alrighty, so this question I really like because I feel like I have a lot of different people coming on this podcast. Last week we had Elijah, who was really great, and I also asked him this question. And I feel like based off of where you're rooted in your identities and your own educational experiences, you'll come to a different understanding of this question. But what is your ideal version of education? And how are you, one, working towards this version, or how would you go about creating it?
I think my ideal education system would understand that education is health policy, and like education and health are so connected. I wish we took a public health approach to education and really understood that general well-being and our learning and what we know, but maybe even more importantly, like how we know something impacts our life experiences and ultimately like our life trajectory of death or life. Like that sounds dire, but it's true. Like education as a social determinant of health is the strongest predictor of good health over all other factors. And if you have like even just a high school diploma, I feel like a broken record, but it optimizes your life chances, and decreases your risk of disease, and it like a profound amount. And so I think that's a simple answer to a very broad question.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of nuance in there, but it's something I think about a lot, because if we did take a public health approach to education, we have to rethink not only policy, but like what is the role of a school? And is it really just teachers transmitting specific or particular knowledge to students for them to consume, or is it something else? And who belongs in a school, and what's the role of the school in the community? That's something I think about a lot. And I think that schools are part of a healthy community, and that can look like a lot of different things, but yeah, I think that when we take that lens, it shapes the language we use, what sort of spaces, physical spaces we're creating, and how we approach relationships and supporting students to succeed.
I love that. There's something when you said, what is the role of a school? It seems like such a simple question and such a simple, and that has a simple answer, but it actually made me feel like very different. And I'm sitting here trying to think about what I think a school should be fostered and how it should be created. And I think other people should take the time to really think about that and who is in these spaces or who should be in these spaces. So I feel like a lot of schools partake in exclusion of like who's allowed in, who's not allowed in. And I think because we're speaking about public school systems, it is a place where, quote unquote, everyone should be allowed to belong. And I feel like belonging, especially in high school when you're a teenager and you're already going through identity crises at home and within your friends group, not feeling like you belong in an institution just adds additional pressures to your life. So yeah, that's
absolutely. Yeah, and it just makes you think about whole other factors like who's represented in the school and what does that look like and what opportunities are concentrated among who. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, that was great. That's so great.
Big question.
I'm literally going to write that in my journal and just like dwell on that tonight. Thanks, Maddy. Okay. So what is the greatest lesson you've learned outside of school? Because I feel like as people in academia, a lot of times we can fall into the understanding that school is the only place where you can achieve success. And I feel like life and things that happen outside of school actually benefit to your knowledge and your growth as a person and even just networking skills. So for the people who aren't necessarily interested in graduate school or just even pursuing an undergrad, what is something that you learned outside of the walls of an institution that really impacted the way you live your life today?
Absolutely. Gosh, I gotta think about that. I mean, in high school, I skipped so often. Like, I really was disengaged. And I think part of that's because I was interested in doing other things in the community or in the learning that I was being exposed to outside of school. So I really like this question.
I love that realness. Like, thank you for being real about your experience, because I feel like kids in high school right now who are skipping and just like aren't interested in school feel like education or like university or college may never be a path for them, but that's not true. And I feel like that's a misconception that is constantly thrown around in the halls of high school. But also just like, you're allowed to live your life. Like, if you're an artist, just be who you are in that moment. And if education finds you, it finds you.
Yeah. And I truly believe that you can be successful, whatever your definition of that is, if you are like, any decision I make is really just intuition and like, what am I gravitating towards? And I think that education is the same thing. Like, go towards your interests, whether you're concerned about career or whatever. Like, if you're really passionate about something and interested in something, that is where the most important type of education will happen. I like remember to trust the process and just know that what will happen, only worry about things that are in your control. Yeah, I think just trusting yourself and other people and the fact that change is inevitable and you have the power to shape it is probably something I've learned. And also that hope is like something you have to practice every day, not necessarily just like a blind faith that things will work out, but really just committing to hope as a value is really important for like self-care, but also just as someone who is interested in social justice, can be very like easy to burn out or just feel like discouraged or whatever. I think understanding your relationship to hope and how you practice it helps prevent burnout and sustain movements or even just individual involvement.
Yo, sis, you're dropping like bars and gems right now. I literally am typing as you're speaking. Just like hope is a daily process, and you need to understand what your relationship is with hope. That's deep. And I hope the listeners and the viewers are really paying attention to that, because I feel like we can get lost in the ideals of achieving success and ideals of like what other people want for us. But it's like when you're like looking inside yourself and just like hoping, even if it's just for a better life, because when you do come from for example, like the north side of a city, and it's dwelling and it might not be the best financial situations, and you're like just hanging on to hope that one day your situations that you're going to create are better. I just feel like knowing what that hope is and like trying to thrive, or thrive for that's great. I love that.
Yeah, like Mariam Kaba, this amazing like educator and activist in the States. She says, and I want to get it right. She says, "Let this moment not lead you into despair, but radicalize you." And with that, she says like hope is a discipline, and I think that's so important, especially in 2020 and beyond. Like these are the types of things we need to stay grounded in.
Yeah, I love that. Moving on to more great advice. I want to know, what advice would you give to any teenage white identifying young girl who is trying to pursue a career in the field of social justice?
Yeah, growing up, I was taught that as a woman, it's political and progressive to use your voice and be vocal. And now that I'm older and in these more critical spaces, and thinking about what this means intersectionally, it's often just as important, if not usually more important, to not speak and use the space and power you have to amplify other voices and listen, like really listen and support what they're saying. And I think for young women who are already aware of the fact that they're taking up space, young white women who are already aware, something I've heard a lot as well is like they want opportunities, but they also don't want to take up space, and it feels like this tension, which I'm not even really sure if that like just makes space. But for women who are feeling that way, I just say like be the role model for younger white women that you would have wanted. Like someone like a white woman that I admire a lot is Jane Fonda, because she's been vocal and anti-racist forever. And like she for me is a role model of like the type of person I'd want to be. And we can't erase our identities or the color of our skin, but you can change what that means. And I think that that's also something that's important, is just be the best version, and constantly reflecting and being mindful of what that means without taking up too much space, or being performative, I guess, is a better way.
Yeah.
And I think something else I think about in that question is like pursuing a career in social justice just feels like a weird thing to me, like especially make sure working for nonprofits or charitable sector. But I think social justice has a place everywhere. But also, like, I don't know, I just think it's inappropriate in many instances where white women go into like equity consulting, and they're profiting off injustice and oppression. Or like Robin DiAngelo, who's made buckets of money for her book White Fragility without giving it back to the community. I just think if you're going to profit off it, that's also something you really need to think about.
Yeah.
And are your values actually guiding you, or is it something else?
Mm-hmm. Especially right now with social justice being just a hot topic. So a lot of people are just hopping onto that bandwagon and using like blogs and their Instagram as a form of like activism. But something that you said earlier, it's just performative. It's not actually like centering yourself. But I do think, like what you were saying earlier when you were speaking about girls who feel like there's a tension of wanting to speak and then also feeling like they shouldn't be speaking. And I do think there's a time and a place, like same way I'm biracial. I wouldn't just go up to speak about Black issues on a panel because I'm not exposed to the whole Black experience. I don't, like, although I navigate spaces as a Black woman, I am still the center of colorism and what it's like to be sought after and just like certain things in that nature. But what I can speak to is growing up in a low-income community. What I can speak to is police brutality, and I can speak to the immigration system. So it's just like when I'm taking up spaces, I take up spaces that I can actually speak to. And I feel like same thing can be said in London. Me and my brother do a backpack drive every single year. Shout out to him. But one thing we noticed in the first area that we did it in, Pond Mills is where I grew up, and there's Toronto people call it something different, but we call it complexes. So just like townhouses connected together. And there's about 6 within the area I grew up. So obviously financially and resource wise, we couldn't do all 6 in a year. So what we do is break up every year, we go to one. And the first one we did in Cleveland, literally there was more white kids who were poor than any other color. And it was because of drug addiction. And for me at the time, I was also doing research and looking into BIPOC kids who were underprivileged and low socioeconomic. And I really had to reconsider what I was spewing in my data because I was seeing it through my lens only, because in my complex, there was majority Black kids and like Muslim folks. So what I was seeing was brown and Black folks. But when I went to just down the hill from me, it wasn't that reality. So it's just like, when we're thinking about statistics and our narrative, what does that look like? So there are white girls and white boys who can actually talk to poverty. And I don't think they should be shut out of those conversations, because the same thing is like addiction. I think that is something, if you're experienced with and you have that experience, you have the right to speak about it. So I think just as a person of color, it is wrong for us to shut out white people if they're allowed to be centered in that conversation. What I don't think any white person should do is try to speak on Black issues or Indigenous issues.
Yeah. And just like to your previous comment, I've never seen a person of color try shut down someone else, like a person trying to speak from their experience either. So I don't think like there's actual don't want to suggest there's like exclusion of white people. No. No.
No, but I do feel like there is, like you're saying, there's a tension of being like, oh, I shouldn't speak to that. And I don't want anybody to feel like you should never speak, because women, you are still a part of a minority group.
I think identity is where you start from.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to remember that like identity politics don't exist, because all politics are identity politics.
Yeah.
Some are invisibilized as neutral and some are painted as not, which is not true at all. Like I think identity is present regardless of where you are. So I just really have no time for that discourse. And when you start from your own identity, your own experience, and you're authentic, that's when intersections
mm-hmm.
and like effective, meaningful communication happens, and where those different intersections of experiences are revealed. And so I think building solidarity that way is sustainable and absolutely worthwhile.
Yeah, I agree. That is, again, that's something that's like constantly ongoing and just learning. I'm learning every day how to be a better ally and what that looks like, even in the Black experience. And it sounds so funny to be like, I'm an ally for Black folks when I'm Black myself, but it is true. Is like, how can I better support this community that I'm a part of? How can I better support Indigenous people? And I think it's just with learning and constantly ongoing. Even just like learning my language from London, where I'm from, the way we talk about community members or drug users is very bad. And it's just like, I've been working a lot on how to readdress just the way I'm using like basic words, like not saying crackheads. How do I approach these people who are just actually facing addiction or a mental health issue? How can we go about speaking through these things in a way that makes sense? And I do think it starts with high school students and just having those conversations. And I have a little sister, so I'm constantly correcting her. And it might be annoying, but it's better that she's corrected in high school than have to go out into the world and be corrected by strangers that is sometimes actually even met with anger. So I feel like what we need to get better at, just as a society in general, is understand that people all have different learning positions in life.
And being comfortable and like appreciative of when people do actually take the time to correct you.
100%.
Like I wouldn't know anything I know about social justice without other people who have experiences and knowledge different from me, whether that be from their own experience, like sharing it with me. I don't want to take that for granted.
Yeah.
Like that is a privilege to have someone like see that their energy is worth like helping you grow.
I call it like checking. And I do, like, I heard a lot, like you need to be calling people in instead of calling people out. But I think it's sometimes being too polite and finding the appropriate moment to talk to someone. I'm not going to say it's like unrealistic, but I think to just be checked, like, yo, what you're saying is wrong. Here's the information. Yeah. I think that's so much more effective, especially when you're dealing with teens. Like, teens are sassy, they have attitude. Like, you need to confront, you need to speak their language. And sometimes it's like, hey dude, like that's inappropriate because of this. And I feel like the assumption of intelligence is like, kids are very, very smart. Like, if you say it to them in a way that makes sense, they're going to get it and they're going to be able to correct their behavior in the moment. But if you just like let it slip, like, hey, what you said was wrong, try not to say it again, like, no, that doesn't work. And I feel like,
and I think we also need to get over the idea that like only if you have lived experience are you in like position to check someone.
Mm.
We can't allow that onus to be on people who are experiencing marginalization. And I think like it's really important, like we're all constantly, just making sure that it's part of culture and just a social norm to learn that way, and like not take it personally. It's just, okay, thank you, move on.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Just because you're not in that identity doesn't mean you can't correct somebody. Yeah, that's dope.
And most of the time, like, it's not a comment on a person's character most of the time. Like, if they keep doing it after they've been corrected, then it is. But if someone is genuinely ignorant, like, I don't know, they only know what they know.
Yeah,
so.
I agree. I also think we just use the word ignorant in a way that means like mean and bad, but we need to also, that's one of the words we need to get over and use in a more effective way, because ignorance just means you don't know. So how can I educate you in a way that allows you to understand? Or how can I educate myself? Sorry, I was ignorant. I feel like people are really dismissive of when you say that. But
and the fact that like there is a type of ignorance that's like accidental lack of knowledge, but then the more pressing type of ignorance, and I've been learning a lot about this like in school recently, it's like the epistemology of ignorance. It's like it's a structurally conditioned way of knowing, and that actually is like an epistemic practice in itself. It's not just a lack of knowledge that's easily rectified. It's like we're taught to think in a way that is ignorant, and in doing so, it completely blinds us to even thinking critically about how we are ignorant, or even acknowledging that we are. It's really insidious, but yeah, I think we really need to start talking about that as well. It's like, it's not just a lack of knowledge, it's we're taught to not know just as much as we're taught to know sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for all of the gems. This is really great. I'm really excited to go back and listen to everything and pull quotes. I'm gonna have my journal beside me, writing down all the gems that you have said. But I want to just end on this note, and I think just knowing how people live their lives daily says a lot about who that person is. So what is your mantra, and what are you constantly telling yourself on a day-to-day basis?
I said it earlier, but I just trust the process.
I love that. Yeah. Right now on my wall, I have be cautious of your time and how you're spending it. And I just feel like, for me, I used to just like always be like, time is a social construct, but my time is my energy. So what am I putting towards my time? And it is, I'm also a trust the process, and my time is just led by whatever how the world moves me and what it wants me to take up.
Yeah, I also feel what I feel when I'm feeling it in the moment. I don't think there's anything productive in suppressing emotions. Like sometimes you have to, but I think if you really just acknowledge what's happening while it is, and reflect and are mindful, then that's just a healthy way to live.
I love that. Thank you, Maddy, so much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure speaking to you. As always, it is always a pleasure. And I'm so glad that we've been able to just build upon our friendship, and that you continue to enlighten me and share knowledge. I think the power of storytelling and just understanding where everyone comes from is such a powerful way to navigate spaces and understand each other. So thank you for sharing your story. Thank you to everyone who is listening to our second episode of Segregated Knowledge. Please tune in to our next episode. like, subscribe, and comment, and feel free to share with your friends. Thank you.